Hey there, and welcome back to Drowsy History. If this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this. This is a channel about history told slowly, long, unhurried stories about other times and other people, told in the quiet hours when the day is finally behind you, and all you really need is a voice to carry you the rest of the way toward sleep. Before we begin tonight, two small things. First, if this channel has helped you sleep, or if you just find yourself here often and you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It's free. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps these videos find more people who need them. You can always do it when you wake up, if you remember. Second, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. It's one of my favorite things about making this channel, hearing from people in different cities and different countries and different time zones, all doing the same thing at the same moment, all getting quiet, all letting go. I love knowing the shape of that. So tell me where you are. Now, take a breath, get comfortable, let your hands go still, and let's begin. Tonight we're going somewhere that might surprise you. We're not going to the ancient world. We're not crossing into the medieval. We're staying relatively close, chronologically speaking, just far enough back that the world we're visiting already feels genuinely strange, already has the texture of somewhere that doesn't quite exist anymore, somewhere that has passed into the kind of history that people are only now beginning to fully understand. We're going to the 1980s. Specifically, we're going to Wall Street. And even more specifically, we're going to sit for a long, quiet evening inside the life of the particular kind of person who defined that place and that decade. The young Wall Street broker, the rising trader, the man in the double-breasted suit with the slicked hair and the red suspenders and the phone perpetually pressed to one ear, surrounded by noise and money and a kind of frantic energy that the decade seemed to manufacture in almost unlimited quantities. This is a world that has been written about, filmed, mythologized, satirized, and thoroughly picked over in the decades since it ended. You probably know the broad strokes: Gordon Gekko, junk bonds, insider trading, cocaine in the bathroom at midnight. The movies gave us a version of this world that is loud and fast and garish and not entirely wrong. But as with every world that gets turned into a movie, the movie version leaves most of the actual texture on the cutting room floor. What it was actually like, not the peak moments, not the scandal and the excess, but the daily grain of it, the hours and the habits and the things that happened on an ordinary Tuesday. That's what we're going to try to find tonight. The real thing underneath the mythology, slow, detailed, without urgency, because that's how we do things here. So settle in. This is going to take a while, and that's the whole point. To understand what it meant to be a young Wall Street broker in the 1980s, you have to first understand the specific moment in American history that produced them, because that moment was genuinely unusual, a convergence of economic, political, cultural, and technological forces that created conditions unlike anything that had come before, and that would not quite exist again in the same form. The 1980s on Wall Street were not just a period of prosperity. They were a period of transformation, and the people who rode that transformation were changed by it in ways that shaped everything about how they lived and thought and moved through the world. The story begins in the most direct sense with what came before. The 1970s had been, for the American economy, a decade of genuine difficulty. Inflation had been severe and persistent. At its worst in the late 1970s, the annual inflation rate in the United States was running close to 15%, which meant that money was losing its value faster than most ordinary investments could compensate for. Interest rates, raised by the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker to combat that inflation, had climbed to levels that seemed almost unimaginable. The prime rate, the benchmark lending rate for banks, peaked above 20% in 1980 and 1981, meaning that borrowing money of any kind was extraordinarily expensive. The stock market had been essentially flat for most of the decade, delivering real returns close to zero after inflation was accounted for. The American economy felt stagnant, and the culture around it reflected that stagnation, a kind of exhausted, low grade anxiety about whether the post war prosperity that had seemed so permanent was actually permanent after all. Then, beginning in 1982, something shifted. Volcker's interest rate policy had done its work. Inflation came down sharply and quickly, and with it came a new set of economic conditions. Interest rates began to fall. The stock market began to rise, not modestly, not gradually, but with a sustained force and momentum that would carry it, with some interruptions, for the better part of 18 years. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had been hovering around 850 points in the summer of 1982, would cross 2,000 by the end of 1986 and nearly 3,000 by the time the decade ended. That is more than a tripling in nominal terms in roughly 7 years, and for the people who were positioned to benefit from it, who were in the market, who understood its mechanics, who were employed in the institutions that moved capital around the economy. It was a transformation in personal fortune of a kind that very few periods in American history have produced. People got rich fast. Young people got rich especially fast. And the culture that formed around that phenomenon was by any measure something genuinely new. But it wasn't just the stock market rising that made the 1980s feel different. There were structural changes to the financial industry itself that amplified everything. Deregulation was perhaps the most important. Under Reagan, and to some extent Carter before him, the rules that had governed financial markets since the Depression era were systematically loosened. Interest rate ceilings on bank deposits were lifted. Restrictions on what kinds of activities different kinds of financial institutions could engage in were relaxed. The rules governing how companies could be acquired, merged, and restructured were changed in ways that made a whole new category of financial transaction possible. The junk bond market, high yield bonds, used to finance leveraged buyouts of companies, was essentially invented in this period by a man named Michael Milken at Drexel Burnham Lambert, and the consequences of that invention cascaded through the entire economy in ways that few people fully understood while they were happening. There was also technology. The computerization of financial markets was accelerating through the 1980s in ways that fundamentally changed how trading worked, how fast information moved, and what kinds of strategies were possible. Bloomberg terminals began appearing on trading desks. Electronic data feeds began replacing the old ticker tape. The sheer volume of transactions that could be processed in a day increased dramatically. The pace of everything got faster. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange, which had always been a chaotic place, became more chaotic. The trading desks of the big investment banks, which had once operated at a certain deliberate pace, became scenes of controlled frenzy. Hundreds of people working phones and screens simultaneously, executing transactions at speeds that would have been impossible a decade earlier. And into this specific moment, this convergence of rising markets, deregulation, new financial instruments, and accelerating technology came a generation of young people who had been trained or who trained themselves to take advantage of it. They came from the business schools that had been expanding their finance programs throughout the 1970s, from Harvard and Wharton and Columbia and the University of Chicago, with their quantitative methods and their new theoretical frameworks for pricing risk and valuing assets. They came from the middle class suburbs of the Northeast and the Midwest, from modest backgrounds that gave them a particular hunger for the kind of money that was suddenly, theoretically, available to anyone who was smart and aggressive and willing to work hard enough. They came from everywhere, essentially, drawn by the same gravitational pull, the possibility, real and demonstrated by the people who had arrived slightly earlier, of becoming genuinely, substantially, life changingly wealthy before the age of 30. These were the stock bros of the 1980s, and the world they entered when they walked through the doors of the big banks and brokerage houses, Smith Barney, Merrill Lynch, Salomon Brothers, Goldman Sachs, Bear Stearns, Kidder Peabody, was one of the most intense, most demanding, and most bizarre work environments that American professional life had ever produced. The typical path into Wall Street in the 1980s began with college, and more specifically, with a particular kind of college experience that was shaped from fairly early on by the specific requirements of getting hired. The major investment banks recruited heavily from a small number of elite universities: Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia, and from the top public universities that had strong finance programs. Getting a job at Goldman Sachs or Merrill Lynch or Salomon Brothers was for a certain kind of ambitious young person at a certain kind of school the primary objective of the entire college career, and the way that objective was pursued shaped everything. The courses taken, the activities joined, the summer internships sought, the grades maintained, the specific kind of self presentation cultivated in preparation for the interview process. The interview process itself was famously grueling, and it was designed to be. The major banks received thousands of applications for each analyst class they hired, and the selection process was intended to identify the specific combination of intelligence, competitiveness, stamina, and social facility that the work would require. Technical questions tested quantitative ability, discounted cash flow analysis, option pricing, bond math, accounting fundamentals. Case studies tested business judgment and the ability to construct and defend an argument under pressure. But the interviews were also, at a deeper level, a social test, a test of whether you could hold yourself together and project confidence and competence in a high pressure conversation with someone who was deliberately trying to rattle you. The banks hired people who could do this, not just because those skills were useful in the specific job, but because the culture they were hiring into valued those particular qualities above most others. The business schools played a different but related role. An MBA from Wharton or Harvard Business School was in the 1980s close to a golden ticket into the higher levels of Wall Street, the associate level above the analysts, with significantly higher compensation and a faster track to the really serious money. Business school graduates came in with more credentials and more polish, but they came in debt. MBA programs were expensive even then, and the pressure to earn back that investment quickly shaped their approach to the work with its own particular urgency. The compensation structures at the major banks, where the base salary was respectable, but the bonus was where the real money was, meant that the debt from 2 years of business school could theoretically be paid off in a single year of strong performance. Theoretically, which made the prospect feel real, and which meant that the young MBA walking onto a trading floor or into an investment banking division for the first time arrived already calculating, already running the numbers, already measuring the gap between where they were and where they needed to be. The first days on the job had their own specific character, and accounts from people who went through them in the 1980s describe an experience that was simultaneously thrilling and disorienting. The physical space of a major investment bank was unlike any office environment that most of these new hires had encountered before. The trading floors, in particular, were enormous, open, low ceilinged spaces packed with rows of desks, each desk covered in phones and terminals, the whole thing filled at any moment of the trading day with a noise level that made normal conversation impossible without raising your voice. The energy was palpable and physical, a kind of collective nervous tension that seemed to radiate off the walls, that you absorbed through your skin from the moment you walked through the door. The investment banking floors were quieter, more like a conventional office, but with a pace and an ambient pressure that was just as intense in its own different way. The initiation into this world was not gentle. The junior analysts, the youngest members of the hierarchy, were expected to work hours that tested the limits of physical endurance. 14-hour days were not the exception. 16-hour days were common. All-nighters happened regularly enough that they were simply accepted as part of the job rather than emergencies. The work itself, financial modeling, pitch book preparation, deal analysis, administrative support for the senior bankers who actually ran the client relationships, was not glamorous, and the expectation was that it would be done to an extremely high standard, regardless of how long it took or what hour it was when it was finally finished. The senior bankers who supervised the analysts had in most cases gone through the same initiation themselves and felt that the crucible of exhaustion and pressure produced something useful, a kind of toughening, a stripping away of whatever sense of entitlement or self-protection the new hire had brought through the door. By the time you had been an analyst for a year, you had been reshaped, in ways both deliberate and accidental, into something that fit the environment. The social dynamics of those first months were their own education. The major banks, and especially the trading floors, had cultures that had evolved largely without conscious design from the accumulated habits of the people who had populated them for decades, and those cultures were, by contemporary standards, quite extreme. The humor was aggressive. The hierarchies were rigid, and sometimes humiliating. The testing of new arrivals, seeing how they handled pressure, how they responded to being yelled at, whether they could maintain composure when a senior trader publicly destroyed their work in front of everyone, was explicit and ongoing. Women, the few who were present, navigated a set of additional challenges that the men around them generally did not acknowledge. The idea that a workplace should be comfortable or that the people in it should be treated with consistent dignity, regardless of their position, was simply not part of the operating assumptions. You adapted or you left. Outside the office, the young Wall Street broker of the 1980s inhabited a specific kind of New York existence that was shaped by the particular combination of high income, very limited time, and the cultural pressures of performing success in a highly visible way. The apartment was the foundation of this existence, and the apartment told a story. The geography of where young Wall Street professionals lived in the 1980s was fairly concentrated. Manhattan was the preferred address, and within Manhattan, certain neighborhoods dominated, the Upper East Side most of all, which had the specific combination of proximity to good restaurants, the right addresses, and a social scene that was sufficiently moneyed to feel appropriate without being so far upmarket as to be inaccessible on an analyst's or junior associate's salary. The Upper West Side was a more liberal, slightly bohemian alternative, favored by those who wanted to signal a different kind of taste. Downtown, Tribeca and Soho was beginning its transition from warehouse district to fashionable residential neighborhood in the 1980s, and some of the more style conscious young financiers were among the early adopters of that shift. The financial district itself, living near the office, down at the southern tip of Manhattan, was not fashionable but had the practical virtue of a very short commute for people who were going to be in the office at 6 in the morning and not leaving until midnight. The apartments themselves were typically expensive relative to what they offered in terms of square footage, because this was Manhattan and it always has been. A junior analyst earning $40,000 or $50,000 in base salary, a good income in the early 1980s, before bonuses, would spend a disproportionate share of it on housing, often renting a small one-bedroom or a studio in a building that felt appropriate to the image he was trying to project, even if the apartment itself was barely large enough to contain a bed and a dresser and a television. The bonus changed the calculus dramatically. A good first-year bonus could run to another $30,000 or $50,000 on top of the base, and by the mid-1980s, at the peak of the bull market, bonuses for successful traders and bankers could reach multiples of the base salary, numbers that made the Manhattan real estate market look suddenly accessible in ways it had not been before. The interior of the young Wall Street broker's apartment in the 1980s reflected, in its physical details, the specific texture of the life being lived there. It was not, for the most part, a space that received a great deal of attention or care. The hours were too long, the pace too relentless, for the apartment to be much more than a place to sleep and occasionally eat and change clothes. Furniture tended toward the functional and the quick, a bed that was usually nice, because sleep was precious and the bed was the one domestic object that directly affected performance. A couch for the evenings, when exhaustion made watching television the only available activity. A small dining table that mostly served as an overflow surface for work brought home from the office. Personal items were sparse. Plants tended to die because no one was home to water them. Bookshelves, if present, held a specific kind of library: business books, finance texts, the occasional thriller or spy novel for the rare vacation that reflected the priorities of the occupant. The kitchen was often the most underutilized room in the apartment, not because the person who lived there didn't value food. The 1980s Wall Street culture was, in its public manifestations, extremely food obsessed, devoted to specific restaurants and specific wines and specific rituals of conspicuous consumption that were as much about status as about pleasure. But because the home kitchen, in the context of a 14-hour workday and a social life conducted almost entirely in restaurants and bars, barely figured. Cereal and coffee in the morning, if even that. Delivery menus from the 3 or 4 restaurants whose numbers were memorized for the occasional late night when you actually ate at home instead of at the office or at a client dinner. The refrigerator typically held beer, some condiments, whatever had been delivered 2 nights ago and not finished, and perhaps a container of orange juice that might or might not still be drinkable. The closet told its own story. Clothing was important in this world, not in the way that it would be important to a fashion person, not as an expression of individual aesthetic, but as a uniform that communicated specific things about your position, your seriousness, your belonging to the particular culture you inhabited. The suit was the fundamental unit of the wardrobe, and suits were expensive, well made, and numerous. A serious player on Wall Street in the mid 1980s owned at least a dozen suits: Armani, Ralph Lauren's Polo, Brooks Brothers for the more traditional types, Hugo Boss for those who wanted something that felt more aggressively modern. The double breasted suit, the power suit silhouette with the wide shoulders and the nipped waist and the peaked lapels, was the uniform of the decade's peak, the physical emblem of the kind of authority and wealth that the whole enterprise was organized around. Ties were bold, patterned, often expensive. Hermes was the gold standard. A Hermes tie on a trading desk in 1985 was a clear signal, understood by everyone who saw it, about what you thought of yourself and what you expected others to think. Shirts were often custom, with the initials monogrammed on the cuffs, a detail that served no practical purpose, but that announced in the particular code of the environment that you had arrived at a level where you could afford to have things made specifically for you. The dress code extended to accessories in a way that might seem excessive today, but that made complete sense within the logic of the culture. The watch was perhaps the most loaded object in the wardrobe: a Rolex Submariner or a Day Date, a Patek Philippe if you were doing especially well, a Tag Heuer if you were slightly earlier in the ascent. The briefcase, typically leather, typically expensive, typically from a brand that people in the industry would recognize. Mark Cross, Coach before it became primarily a women's brand, T. Anthony. Cufflinks, the kind with weight and presence. Shoes that were shined to a specific luster, because shoes were something that older men in the industry were known to look at when assessing the quality of a younger man. All of these details were not trivial, they were a language, and everyone in the environment was fluent in it. The alarm went off early, not the gentle light based alarm of the current era, not the carefully calibrated wake cycle app, but a clock radio or a buzzer, mechanical and merciless, typically set for somewhere between 5:30 and 6 in the morning. For traders who had to be at their desks before the market opened at 9:30 and who used the hours before the open to read overnight news and position themselves for the day, 6 o'clock was already borderline late. For investment bankers, whose hours were less constrained by the market's schedule, but who measured their commitment partly by how early they arrived, 6 or 6:30 was the norm. The morning routine was brief by necessity. A shower, fast. A shave with whatever was on the bathroom shelf. Gillette for most, the occasional expensive French soap for those who had discovered such things through a girlfriend or a trip to Europe. Coffee, black, either made quickly at home or picked up at the deli on the way to the subway or the cab. The suit, selected the night before or in the dark in 30 seconds of fast decision making, laid out on the chair or grabbed from the organized chaos of the closet. The tie, knotted in the practiced automatic way of someone who had done it thousands of times. The shoes, buffed quickly with the brush kept by the door. The briefcase, stuffed with whatever work had been brought home the night before and either completed or not, along with whatever reading needed to be done on the way in. And then out the door into the particular quality of early morning Manhattan, the streets not yet crowded, the air still cool from the night, the city in the process of restarting itself, the delivery trucks and the newspaper vendors and the coffee carts already deployed, the first wave of the working world already in motion before the second and third waves had even woken up. The commute to Wall Street had two main modes, and the choice between them carried its own social meaning. The subway was fast, reliable in a way that surface transportation was not, and completely democratic. In the subway car, the managing director and the mail clerk occupied the same physical space, subject to the same delays and the same smells, and the same cheerless fluorescent lighting. Many junior bankers and traders took the subway regardless of their income level, partly because it was genuinely the most efficient way to travel, and partly because the alternative, a taxi or car service, required either a lucky hail or a scheduled pickup, and at 6 in the morning the taxi situation in Midtown Manhattan was not always cooperative. The taxi, or in later years, the car service, was the preferred mode for those who had reached a certain level. It allowed you to continue working during the commute, to make calls, to read documents without the interruption of other people's proximity, to arrive without having absorbed any of the physical indignities of public transit. By the mid 1980s, when the car phone had arrived, heavy, expensive, installed in the back seat of a car service Lincoln Town car, the antenna mounted on the trunk, the car service commute had become a mobile office, and the sight of a man in a suit talking loudly on a car phone in the back of a car became one of the defining images of the decade. The commute, however short, was one of the few unscheduled intervals in a day that was otherwise entirely structured. On the subway, people read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Barron's, the Financial Times if you were the kind of person who wanted to signal European sophistication, or they simply stood and thought, running through whatever was pressing, rehearsing conversations that were coming, working through the numbers of a deal in their heads. In the car, the phone was used, the documents were reviewed, the day was begun before it officially began. The transition from home to office happened not at the office door, but somewhere in the middle of the commute, when the mental shift from private self to work self completed itself and the performance began. The trading floor was the physical heart of Wall Street in the 1980s, and walking onto one for the first time was an experience that people who did it consistently describe in almost physical terms: a sensory collision, a kind of assault, something that had to be adjusted to before it could be inhabited. The scale of it: these were enormous rooms, acres of open floor covered in rows of desks, each desk stacked with screens and phones, the whole thing lit with the particular cold brightness of fluorescent light. The sound of it: the noise was constant, layered, loud enough to require shouting in normal conversation, a mixture of hundreds of voices, and the persistent electronic chirping of incoming calls, and the specific percussion of keyboards being used by people who were typing fast because fast was the only appropriate speed. The smell of it: the specific mixture of coffee and cigarettes, and the particular human warmth of a very large number of people packed into a confined space, the faint chemical smell of the terminal screens, and underneath all of it, the specific adrenaline charged quality of the air that seemed to have absorbed the energy of the room. The hierarchy of the trading floor was visible in its physical layout. Senior traders and partners occupied the best positions, typically the center of the floor, where sight lines were good and where the flow of information from multiple directions converged, while junior traders worked the perimeter or the back rows, in the positions where you were slightly more removed from the action, but still part of it, still absorbing the ambient information that moved through the room in real time. The physical desk itself was the unit of territorial claim. Your screens, your phones, your position blotter, the coffee cup that had been there since 7 this morning. The jacket hung on the back of the chair at the exact angle that communicated current availability without complete commitment to staying. Everything within arm's reach had a reason to be there. Nothing on a trading desk was decorative. The phones deserve special attention because they were in the pre-internet, pre-instant messaging world of 1980s trading, the primary technology of the work. The trading desks used specialized turret phone systems, multi-line consoles that could handle dozens of calls simultaneously, with direct lines to specific institutional clients, direct lines to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, direct lines to counterparts at other banks, and a general line for incoming calls from anyone else. A good trader knew his phone system the way a pianist knows a keyboard. The positions of specific lines were memorized. The ability to pick up the right line, put a call on hold, conference in a third party, manage 3 conversations simultaneously was a technical skill that took months to develop and that separated the people who had it from those who were still fighting the technology. The sound of the phone system, the specific tone of an incoming call on the direct line from a major client, was something that conditioned a specific physical response, a sharpening of attention that happened automatically, without conscious effort, after enough repetitions. The information environment of the trading floor was, by the standards of later decades, primitive, but by the standards of what had come before, it was dense and fast and constantly accelerating. The Bloomberg terminal, which would eventually become the dominant information system in the financial industry, was in its early stages in the 1980s. Michael Bloomberg had founded the company in 1981, and the terminals began appearing on trading desks in significant numbers through the mid decade. Before Bloomberg was ubiquitous, traders relied on a combination of Quotron terminals for real time price data, Dow Jones news wires for breaking information, the paper research reports that flowed from the bank's own research departments and from outside analysts, and above all on the network of personal relationships with traders at other firms, with salespeople, with portfolio managers at the big institutional investors that transmitted information, rumor, interpretation, and positioning intelligence in real time through the phones and through the face to face conversations that happened in the hallways and the conference rooms and the elevators and the restaurants. The pace of a trading day was not uniform. The market opened at 9:30, which created a specific kind of intensity in the preceding hour and a half as traders positioned themselves for the open, reviewed overnight news, talked to counterparts in London, where the markets had already been open for hours, and in Tokyo, where they had already closed, and developed their initial view of where things were likely to go. The open itself was a period of maximum noise and maximum activity, as the accumulated overnight information was processed by the market all at once. Prices moved quickly in one direction and then another, and the first major decisions of the day were executed. Then a period of slightly less frenzied activity in the mid morning as the market found its initial footing, then another surge at midday as fresh news arrived or institutional investors moved large blocks, then the afternoon positioning as traders adjusted their books before the close, then the close itself at 4 o'clock, and then the aftermath, the settling of accounts, the assessment of the day's performance, the phone calls to clients, the conversations with management about what had happened and what was going to happen tomorrow. The language spoken on the trading floor was its own dialect, compressed and cryptic and dense with technical meaning. A shorthand evolved from the specific needs of people who had to communicate fast and precisely across a very noisy room. Numbers were truncated, not 100,000 shares, but 100. Prices were quoted in fractions because American stocks still traded in fractions of a dollar before decimalization came at the end of the next decade. The grammar was minimal. A complete thought might be conveyed in 5 or 6 words that would be opaque to an outsider, but perfectly clear to anyone who had been on the floor for a month. This compression was not affectation, it was efficiency, the evolution of language under the specific pressure of a need to communicate faster than full sentences allowed. The word stockbroker covers a range of quite different activities that are worth distinguishing because the experience of the job varied significantly depending on which part of the financial industry you worked in. The most common public image, the retail broker at a firm like Merrill Lynch or Smith Barney, working with individual clients to manage their investment portfolios, was one reality. The institutional salesperson, covering large investment clients like pension funds and insurance companies on behalf of a major bank, was a different reality. The proprietary trader, who traded the firm's own capital according to his own judgment, was yet another. And the investment banker, who advised corporations on mergers and capital raising and was technically not a broker at all, occupied yet another space. Each of these roles had its own specific rhythms, its own specific pressures, and its own specific relationship to the markets and the money that flowed through them. The retail broker's day was organized around clients, the individuals and small institutions whose portfolios he managed and who relied on his recommendations to make their investment decisions. This was a relationship business in the most direct sense. The broker's income, which was primarily commission based, depended on generating transactions, and generating transactions depended on maintaining relationships with clients who trusted his judgment enough to act on his recommendations. The morning began with research, reading the overnight news, talking to the firm's research analysts to understand what new recommendations had been issued, forming a view of which clients might benefit from which pieces of information, and structuring the day's calls accordingly. The calls themselves were the substance of the work, opening with whatever pleasantry was appropriate to the relationship, transitioning to whatever information or recommendation was the purpose of the call, closing with whatever transaction could be justified by the conversation. A productive day might involve 40 or 50 outbound calls. A slow day might involve 20. The mental state required to make those calls with consistent energy and enthusiasm, regardless of how the market was performing or how the previous conversation had gone, was its own particular discipline, a performance of optimism and competence that had to be sustained across 8 or 10 hours, whether or not the underlying reality supported it. The institutional salesperson operated in a related but somewhat different mode. His clients were not individuals, but institutions, the portfolio managers at pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, endowments, and the other large pools of capital that collectively dominated the market. The relationships were deeper and the transactions were larger. Where a retail broker might generate a commission on a trade of 10,000 shares, an institutional salesperson might be involved in a block trade of 1 million shares, and the commission economics scaled accordingly. The information edge that he provided to these clients, proprietary research from the firm's analysts, early intelligence on deal flow, access to the firm's trading desk for large transactions that needed to be executed efficiently, was the currency of the relationship, and maintaining that edge required constant investment in the relationship itself. Regular calls, regular visits, regular entertainment, the entire apparatus of client management that was such a significant part of the institutional sales job. The proprietary trader was a different creature from either of these. He did not manage client relationships in the same sense. He managed his book, his portfolio of positions, long and short, across whatever markets and instruments he was responsible for, and he was judged on the profit and loss that book generated, full stop. The directness of this accountability was one of the things that attracted a certain kind of person to trading. There was no ambiguity, no soft factors, no politics that could obscure the underlying truth of whether you were adding value. The number was the number. The trader knew it at the end of every day, down to the dollar, and so did his manager, and so did everyone else on the desk. This clarity was exhilarating when the number was good and brutal when it was not, and the oscillation between those states, sometimes within the same day, sometimes within the same hour, defined the specific psychological landscape of the trading life. The investment banker, at the higher end of the Wall Street hierarchy in terms of both prestige and eventual compensation, worked in a different mode from all of these. His days were organized around deals, the mergers, acquisitions, initial public offerings, bond issuances, and other large transactions that companies needed to execute and for which they paid the banks very large fees. The deal cycle had its own rhythm, a long period of pitching, of presenting ideas to potential clients, and trying to win the mandate to execute the transaction. A middle period of due diligence and structuring and documentation, in which the intellectual and analytical content of the work was concentrated, and then a closing period of execution in which the deal was actually consummated and the fee was earned. Throughout all of this, the banker was managing multiple deals simultaneously at different stages of the cycle, which meant that the days were typically fragmented. A morning spent on a pitch for a potential new client, an afternoon on a diligence call for a deal already in process, an evening at a client dinner for a relationship that needed maintenance, a late night putting the finishing touches on a presentation that was needed the next morning. The ability to context switch rapidly, to hold multiple complex situations in the mind simultaneously and attend to each with appropriate intensity, was the fundamental cognitive requirement of the banking job. In any honest account of what life was like for a Wall Street broker in the 1980s, the bonus has to occupy a central place because the bonus was the organizing principle of the entire professional existence, not the salary. The salary was respectable and well above the national average, but it was not the thing that made the job different from other well paying professional jobs. The bonus was the thing. The annual cash payment, typically made in December or January, that could range from a modest increment above the salary in a bad year to multiples of the salary in a good one, was what the entire year was organized around, what the 100-hour weeks were in service of, what the performance management and the deal completion and the client retention were ultimately aimed at producing. The bonus was the reason that people who had alternatives, who had been offered jobs at law firms and consulting companies and corporate America, chose Wall Street instead. The bonus culture of the 1980s was, even by the standards of later decades, remarkable. The absolute numbers were large enough by mid-decade that they were genuinely transformative, genuinely capable of changing the material conditions of a life, genuinely sufficient to make possible things that were not possible on salary alone. The apartment upgrade, the country house in the Hamptons, the serious art collection, the private school for the children who were starting to arrive in these people's late 20s and early 30s. A managing director at a major bank in 1986 or 1987, in a good year, might receive a bonus of several $100,000 on top of a base salary of $150,000. A star trader in a great year might receive a bonus of $1 million or more. These were numbers that did not exist in most other contexts in American professional life, and the people receiving them were aware of that fact, and it shaped how they thought about themselves and their relationship to the world. The anticipation of the bonus was itself a cultural phenomenon. In the weeks leading up to the December announcement, the speculation was constant and public. Who had done well, whose deals had closed, whose book had performed, whose clients had generated the most fees. The conversations happened at the desk and in the elevators and over drinks after work, an ongoing collective assessment of relative performance that was partly informational and partly a kind of psychological preparation for the number that was coming. When the actual figure arrived, delivered typically in a brief meeting with a direct manager, the number written on a piece of paper and slid across the desk, the response varied enormously by individual and by year. Some people were delighted, some were disappointed, some were furious, convinced that their number did not reflect their actual contribution, that the politics had worked against them, that someone had stolen credit that was rightfully theirs. The anger was often expressed loudly in conversations that were probably not as private as the people having them imagined. The period immediately after bonus season had its own characteristic behavior. The apartment market in Manhattan saw a specific spike in high end purchases and upgrades in January and February each year. The car dealerships in the tri state area, particularly the ones handling Porsches and BMWs and Mercedes, did a disproportionate share of their annual volume in the first quarter. The jeweler in Midtown, who had developed a relationship with the finance crowd, saw a significant bump. The Hamptons real estate market, where a summer rental house was a near obligatory status marker for anyone who had reached a certain level, moved visibly. The consumption that followed bonus season was not subtle, and it was not meant to be subtle. It was a public declaration of the year's result, a performance of success that the culture both required and rewarded. Lunch on Wall Street in the 1980s deserves its own extended treatment because it was not a meal in any simple sense. It was a social institution, a ritual of relationship management, a performance of status, and a theater of consumption that took place daily at a specific set of restaurants in lower and midtown Manhattan, and that functioned as one of the primary mechanisms through which the business of Wall Street was actually conducted. The deals that were discussed in conference rooms and on phone calls were also discussed over lunch. The relationships that generated deal flow and institutional mandates were maintained over lunch. The hierarchies of the industry were enacted and reenacted over lunch in the specific code of who was seated where, who was hosting whom, who had the best table, whose expense account was supporting the meal, and at what level of extravagance. The expense account was the lubricant of all of this. The major investment banks and brokerage firms maintained entertainment budgets that were, by the standards of most industries, extraordinarily generous, because they had understood, since at least the post-war era, that the maintenance of client relationships required regular expensive hospitality, and that the cost of that hospitality was trivially small relative to the fees that well-maintained relationships generated. A managing director at a major bank in the mid-1980s might have a monthly entertainment budget that ran to thousands of dollars, enough to cover multiple client dinners per week at the kinds of restaurants where the check for two people routinely exceeded $300. These were not perks in the sense that they were things the bank was doing for the benefit of the banker. They were tools, instruments of client management, deployed with the same deliberateness as a marketing campaign or a pitch deck. The restaurants where lunch happened had their own precise geography and their own hierarchies of meaning. In lower Manhattan, near the actual stock exchange, and the trading floors of the major firms. The lunch establishments ranged from the grand and formal Delmonico's, which had been a financial district institution since the 19th century, to the quick and functional, the places where you could have a steak and a martini and be back at the desk within an hour. The Midtown restaurants, clustered around the 52nd to 55th Street corridor, where many of the bank's offices were located, were a different category. Places like Le Bernardin and the Four Seasons and Lutèce, the great French restaurants of the era that were the gold standard of expense account dining, where the food was excellent and the service was impeccable, and the whole experience communicated to the client that his relationship with the firm was valued at the highest level. The power lunch, a term that entered the American vocabulary in this decade, was at its most concentrated in the grill room of the Four Seasons on East 52nd Street. The Four Seasons, designed by Philip Johnson in the landmark Seagram building and serving an American cuisine that was for its era sophisticated and serious, was the apex of the 1980s Wall Street lunch culture. The tables in the grill room were not assigned randomly. The specific tables along the wall, the ones with the best sight lines to the room, the ones that were seen by everyone who entered, were understood by everyone who ate there to be the tables of the most powerful people in the room. To be seated at a table against the wall at the Four Seasons was a public statement of your position in the hierarchy of the New York financial world. To be seated elsewhere was also a statement of a different kind. The maitre d' at the Four Seasons in the mid 1980s was exercising a form of social power that was real and recognized, and everyone who ate there regularly understood it. The food at these lunches was, in the 1980s, organized around a set of specific preferences that reflected the decade's particular relationship to luxury. Protein was primary, the great cuts of beef, the dray-aged prime porterhouse, the double-cut lamb chop, the Dover sole for those who wanted something with slightly more restraint, were the centerpieces. Wine was serious, a good bottle of Burgundy or Bordeaux for an important lunch. The wine list navigated with the deliberate knowledge of someone who understood that his choice was being observed and assessed. The martini had a specific place. A pre-lunch martini or two was a routine part of the midday meal at the most traditional establishments, understood as a social lubricant whose role in the afternoon's work performance was simply not discussed. The food was expensive, the portions were generous, and the check, when it arrived, was placed without ceremony on the expense account, with the specific confidence of someone who had long since stopped thinking about whether he could afford it. The 1980s Wall Street world did not exist in isolation from the broader culture that surrounded it, but its relationship to that culture was specific and self-reinforcing in ways that are worth examining. The young bankers and traders of the decade consumed and produced a specific cultural landscape, and that landscape shaped how they understood themselves and what they aspired to in ways that were not always conscious or acknowledged. The popular culture of the decade was saturated with images of financial success and its accessories. Films like Trading Places, 1983, which was set directly on the floor of the commodity exchange and offered a broadly affectionate portrait of the trading world, and Risky Business, the same year, slightly different milieu, but the same essential fantasy of young person makes money through initiative established a particular cultural mood. Wall Street itself, Oliver Stone's 1987 film, arrived at the peak of the decade's financial frenzy with its portrait of Gordon Gekko, the predatory corporate raider, the prophet of pure greed, the man in the expensive suit who had rationalized the pursuit of money into a philosophy and a way of life. The film was intended as a critique, and Stone meant Gekko to be understood as a villain. What happened instead, as Stone himself later noted with some frustration, was that many of the young men in the audience took Gekko as a role model. His speech, "Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works," landed not as the self indicting confession of a corrupt man, but as the frank articulation of something that many people in the audience already believed. The character Michael Douglas was playing became the thing to be, not the thing to avoid. This said something real about the culture that had produced both the film and its audience. The music of the decade provided a different kind of cultural backdrop. The Wall Street crowd was not, as a whole, the audience for the decade's more critically acclaimed music, the post punk underground, the early hip hop that was being made in the Bronx and in downtown Manhattan at the same time that the traders were making their money in Midtown. Their soundtrack was more likely to be the classic rock that had been the music of their adolescence, Springsteen and the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin, or the sophisticated adult pop and jazz that the decade's upscale culture had designated as appropriate background music for success. The smooth production of Sade and Michael McDonald, the specific mellow quality of what radio programmers began calling light rock in the mid 1980s, music that was unthreatening and pleasurable and that functioned as the sonic wallpaper of a life lived at restaurants and in well appointed apartments. The television of the decade was equally invested in the mythology of wealth. Dynasty and Dallas dominated the primetime ratings for much of the early decade, and their specific aesthetics, the enormous houses, the power suits, the shoulder pads, the direct equation of wealth with glamour and of glamour with power, diffused into the culture in ways that are hard to fully trace but easy to see in retrospect. The finance world took its cues from this aesthetic and reinforced it simultaneously. The suits got broader at the shoulder, the ties got bolder, the cars got more ostentatious, the conspicuous symbols of wealth proliferated across every available surface of the life, because the culture had established that wealth properly performed was one of the most important things a person could communicate about themselves. The nightlife of the decade had its own geography and its own rituals. The clubs that the finance crowd frequented, the ones that occupied the borderland between the financial world and the celebrity and fashion worlds that surrounded it, were specific and famous. Nell's, which opened in 1986 on West 14th Street, was a converted townhouse with the atmosphere of a private members club that attracted a mix of fashion people, musicians, and finance types that felt, at the time, genuinely electric. Area in Tribeca was more extreme in its theatrical ambition. Its designers created a new physical installation every 6 weeks, transforming the interior completely, so that going there was always a slightly different experience. The private rooms in these clubs, where the bottle service and the cocaine happened away from the main floor, were the geography of a specific kind of excess that was by the mid decade simply assumed to be part of what the Wall Street life involved. Cocaine deserves a frank discussion because its presence in 1980s Wall Street culture was so widespread and so well documented that to gloss over it would be dishonest. The drug was not exclusively associated with finance. It was pervasive across multiple professional and creative industries throughout the decade, but it had a particular resonance with the trading floor culture because its specific pharmacology suited the specific demands of the job. Cocaine produces a brief but intense sense of energy, confidence, and alertness, and a willingness to take risks and to speak with great conviction, all of which are qualities that a trader or a salesperson values. It also produces dependence and paranoia, cardiovascular damage, and an increasing inability to function without it, all of which created serious problems for many people who became regular users. The frequency of use varied enormously across the population. Some people in the industry never touched it, others used it occasionally, a significant number used it regularly, and a subset used it heavily enough that it eventually became the central fact of their professional and personal lives. The consequences were, for the heaviest users, severe and sometimes catastrophic. But in the mid decade moment of peak cultural normalization, the use was casual enough that it barely registered as remarkable in many circles. The personal lives of the young Wall Street brokers of the 1980s were shaped by the same forces that shaped everything else about their existence: the hours, the money, the specific culture of performance and competition, the particular kind of identity that the work produced. Relationships formed and fractured against this backdrop in patterns that have been described often enough by enough different people that certain recurring shapes are easy to identify. The marriage or serious relationship occupied a complicated position in the life of someone working the hours that Wall Street required in the 1980s. The partner, most often a woman in this still predominantly male industry, faced a fundamental structural problem. The person she was with was not, in the most practical sense, often present. 14-hour workdays, regular all-nighters, client entertainment that consumed multiple evenings per week, weekend work during deal closings, and the general psychological absorption of someone whose work had colonized most of his mental space meant that the relationship, whatever its official importance in the hierarchy of his values, received in practice a very small portion of his attention and energy. The gap between stated priorities and actually lived ones was, in many of these relationships, large. This was not, for the most part, the result of deliberate choice or bad faith. It was the result of the specific demands of the work and the specific culture of the industry, which made the work the primary identity and everything else secondary. The firms were not unaware of this dynamic. They provided dry cleaning services and car services and meal delivery specifically to reduce the friction that the long hours created in their employees' personal lives, making it easier to stay in the office longer by reducing the practical obstacles to doing so. The infrastructure of the work was, in this sense, deliberately designed to colonize as much of the life as possible, to make the boundary between professional and personal as porous as the employee would tolerate. The children, when they arrived, created a different order of difficulty. A child requires presence in a way that a romantic partner can be negotiated with. A child cannot understand the concept of a deal that needed to close this week, cannot be told that things will be different after this quarter, cannot be compensated for a missed school play with a better vacation. Many of the men who were young bankers and traders in the 1980s describe, in later accounts, a period of their children's early years in which they were essentially absent, arriving home after bedtime, leaving before the household was awake, present on weekends in body, but not always in mind, the phone calls and the work and the mental preoccupation of the job arriving everywhere the physical person did. Some of these men describe this with regret. Some describe it with a kind of resigned acceptance, the sense that this was the deal they had made and that the deal had been worth it. A smaller number describe it as simply the way things were, without visible sentiment in any direction. The specific neighborhoods where the families lived by the time children arrived had moved from the Manhattan apartments of the single years to the suburbs. Greenwich, Connecticut, which became the canonical address for the successful Wall Street family, was close enough to the city to be accessible, but far enough to have the space and the school systems and the specific social world that the particular phase of life required. Westchester County played a similar role. The houses were large because the money was large and because the size of the house communicated the size of the success, and they were furnished with the specific vocabulary of upper middle class East Coast taste in the 1980s. The good antiques mixed with comfortable modern pieces, the substantial artwork, the kitchen that was large enough and well equipped enough to demonstrate that cooking happened there, whether or not it actually did in any frequency. The country club membership, the membership at the right tennis club, the children in the right private schools, these were not incidental details, but structural elements of the life being performed, as important to the social communication of the success as the Rolex and the Hermes tie had been in the earlier pre-family phase. The Hamptons in the 1980s were, for the Wall Street crowd, what they have remained in various forms ever since: the summer theater in which the professional identity was carried into personal life, and the hierarchies of the city were reenacted at the beach, with sand replacing the trading floor, and the car parked in the driveway replacing the office location as the primary spatial indicator of where you stood. To understand the 1980s Wall Street broker fully, you have to understand the Hamptons, because the Hamptons were not a vacation from the work. They were a continuation of it by other means. The geography of the Hamptons, the string of villages along the South Fork of Long Island that run east from Southampton through Watermill, Bridgehampton, East Hampton, and on to Amagansett and Montauk, had its own internal hierarchy that was as precisely understood by its regular inhabitants as the seating chart at the Four Seasons. Southampton was the most established, the old money end, with the biggest estates and the longest history, and a social scene that had deep roots in a specific kind of East Coast Protestant aristocracy that predated the finance boom by several generations. East Hampton was slightly more bohemian in its history. It had been an artist's colony before it was a financial retreat, and retained enough cultural cachet that it attracted writers and filmmakers alongside the bankers, making it feel slightly more cosmopolitan. Bridgehampton and Watermill split the difference. expensive enough to be serious, but not as loaded with historical social weight as the older villages. And then there was the question of whether you rented or owned, and if you owned, whether it was the house you drove past every day or a second property you used only on summer weekends, and if you rented, whether you had a share house with six other people or a whole house to yourself, and if you had a whole house, what the weekly rate was, and whether it had a pool. These distinctions were not trivial. They were the currency of the social economy of the Hamptons' summer, and they were tracked and assessed with the same precision that bonus numbers were tracked and assessed back in the city. The Friday afternoon exodus from Manhattan, the traffic on Route 27 that backed up for miles outside Southampton, the private planes and helicopters that ferried those who could afford to avoid the traffic to the East Hampton airport, the specific cars that moved through the Hamptons traffic in a procession that was itself a kind of moving status display, was an institution. The jitney, the luxury bus service that ran from Midtown Manhattan to the Hamptons, was a social scene in its own right. A captive community of finance and media people who had approximately 2 hours together during which networking happened with the same intensity it happened everywhere else. The weekend routine in the Hamptons had its own specific structure. Saturday morning was the farmers' market in one of the villages, or the garden center, or the beach, depending on the specific social identity being performed. Saturday lunch was at one of the specific restaurants that the community had designated as appropriate. Barristers in Southampton, the laundry in East Hampton, the kind of places where the check was serious but not outrageous, and where the likelihood of running into someone you knew from the city was near certainty. Saturday evening was the dinner party, which in the Hamptons context meant a gathering of somewhere between 8 and 20 people at someone's house or at a restaurant, an occasion for which the men wore khakis and blue Oxford shirts and boat shoes, and the women wore the specific casual but expensive summer uniform of the era, and during which the conversation circled reliably back to the market and the deals and the bonuses, because these were the things that everyone in the room had in common, and that they were all, regardless of the setting and the season, still actively thinking about. Sunday morning had a slightly different quality. The beach, or tennis at the club, or a run, and then the calculation of whether to leave early enough to avoid the worst of the Sunday evening traffic back to the city, or to stay as long as possible and accept the consequences. The Sunday evening return was its own ritual. The car packed with whatever produce had been bought at the farm stand, the weekend bag in the trunk, the couple either talking comfortably or not talking at all, depending on how the weekend had gone, the city reappearing on the horizon as the car crossed the various bridges and expressways that separated the eastern end of Long Island from Manhattan, the mental transition back into work mode happening involuntarily as the skyline came into view, the week already beginning its first small incursions into the weekend's few remaining hours. The physical dimension of the 1980s Wall Street life is something that accounts of the era often underemphasize, focused as they tend to be on the cultural and financial drama. But the body was very much present in this story, and what happened to bodies that were pushed through the specific demands of the trading floor and the banking division for months and years at a time is a genuinely important part of understanding what the life felt like from the inside. The first and most basic physical fact was the hours and what they did to sleep. The human body requires sleep in quantities that the 1980s finance industry simply did not accommodate. Analysts on deal teams might go nights at a time with 3 or 4 hours of sleep, sustained by coffee and adrenaline and the specific urgency of a deal that needed to close. Traders who arrived at 6 in the morning and left at 8 in the evening, 5 days a week, were running a chronic sleep deficit that accumulated over months and years into a kind of baseline exhaustion that became so familiar it no longer registered as unusual. The body adapted as it always adapts to what it is asked to endure, but adaptation in this context meant a recalibration of normal that was not actually healthy, a setting of the baseline fatigue level high enough that the person no longer noticed it as fatigue, just as the ambient condition of being alive. The physical activity that people in the industry used to counteract the sedentary hours at the desk was itself shaped by the culture's specific values. Running was common because it was efficient. You could run in the morning before work or late at night after work without needing anyone else's participation or a specific facility's hours. The Central Park Loop, 6.25 miles around the park's perimeter, was a specific kind of institution, a community of people who ran it before dawn, who recognized each other by their regular appearance, who sometimes ran alongside each other in a kind of companionable silence, or occasionally struck up conversations that began to blur the line between exercise and networking. Racquetball was popular on the West Side clubs and in the basement gyms of some of the larger office buildings. Fast, competitive, playable in 45 minutes, requiring exactly the kind of brief, intense exertion that suited a schedule with no room for anything else. Squash, the more traditional racket sport of the East Coast establishment, was preferred by the more patrician end of the Wall Street culture and played at specific clubs in Midtown that served as social institutions as much as athletic facilities. The eating habits that the hours and the culture produced were by nutritional standards not ideal. The expense account meals, the steaks, the rich sauces, the multiple courses, the serious wine were standard multiple nights per week for anyone with an active client entertainment schedule. The desk eating, the lunches grabbed quickly without sitting down, the dinners ordered in during late night deal work, tended toward whatever was fast and available rather than whatever was healthy. The coffee consumption was prodigious, multiple cups before the market opened, more through the morning, more in the afternoon when the post-lunch energy trough needed to be overridden by chemical intervention. The alcohol, consumed in quantities that varied widely by individual, but that were in many cases substantial, added its own metabolic burden to a system that was already under stress from the hours, and the food, and the stimulants. The heart attack was, in the 1980s Wall Street world, a known occupational hazard. This is not a metaphor. Several high-profile figures in the industry died of cardiac events in their 40s and 50s, and the deaths were understood by the people around them as the specific consequence of the specific life that had been lived. The stress, the food, the long hours, the lack of exercise, the accumulated physical cost of 20 years of operating at maximum intensity. This understanding did not, for the most part, change the behavior. The culture was not one that was organized around personal health maintenance, and the idea of slowing down, of moderating the intensity in the interest of longevity, was not one that the environment encouraged or that the people in it found compelling. You were paid to be intense. Intensity was the job. The body was, in this framework, primarily an instrument of work, and the question of what happened to the instrument over the long term was a question that most people in the culture deferred, indefinitely as it turned out for some of them. The mental health dimension was even less visible. The culture of the 1980s finance industry was not one that acknowledged psychological difficulty or encouraged help seeking. The premium was on resilience, on the ability to absorb losses, handle pressure, perform under stress, and present a consistent face of confidence and capability, regardless of what was happening internally. Depression, anxiety, the specific psychological damage of chronic stress, and sleep deprivation and substance abuse. These things existed in abundance in the population, as they exist in abundance in any population under comparable pressures. They were addressed, in most cases privately, if they were addressed at all, in the therapist's offices in the residential neighborhoods of the Upper East Side, where many of the city's finance professionals lived, in conversations that were understood to be confidential precisely because the acknowledged need for help was itself a vulnerability that the culture could be used against you. Any complete account of what life was like on Wall Street in the 1980s has to grapple seriously with the experience of the women who were there, because the world they inhabited was in many respects the same world that the men inhabited, the same trading floors, the same deal teams, the same restaurants, the same compensation structures, and in many other respects, a fundamentally different one. The 1980s were a decade of significant entry by women into the finance industry, following the professional opportunities that had opened up through the 1970s in law and medicine and business, and the women who entered Wall Street in that decade were, by all accounts, navigating a set of challenges that their male colleagues did not face, and for the most part, did not fully comprehend. The most basic challenge was simply the culture itself, which had been built by and for men over several generations, and which carried that history in every aspect of its operations. The humor was predominantly male in its reference points and its assumptions. The social rituals, the after-work drinks that shaded into long evenings, the strip clubs that were sometimes the settings for client entertainment, the locker room quality of the conversation on many trading desks, were not designed with women as participants in mind, and women who found themselves in these settings had the choice of participating in ways that felt uncomfortable or excluding themselves from social bonding that had real professional consequences. The mentorship networks, the informal information flows, the relationships with senior figures that shaped careers, these were predominantly male networks, and accessing them required a form of social navigation that was simply more difficult for women than for men. The compensation disparity was real and significant. Women in comparable roles earned less than their male counterparts, in some cases, substantially less, a disparity that was documented in litigation throughout the decade and beyond, and that reflected a combination of explicit bias in individual managers' assessments and the structural disadvantages of being excluded from the networks and the visibility opportunities that drove compensation decisions. The legal and regulatory framework that would eventually address these disparities was still developing in the 1980s, and the enforcement of what rules did exist was inconsistent. The women who succeeded in this environment, and some of them succeeded spectacularly, building careers and reputations and compensation levels that were fully competitive with their male counterparts, did so through a combination of exceptional competence and a particular kind of social intelligence about how to navigate the specific terrain. Some of them adopted elements of the dominant male culture, speaking its language, tolerating its rituals, performing the specific kind of toughness that the culture valued in a way that made them legible to the men around them. Others found specific niches in the business, research, certain areas of fixed income, specific client relationships, where the culture was somewhat less hostile and where excellence was more reliably rewarded regardless of gender. A few were simply so visibly talented that the culture accommodated them despite itself, because the business logic of trading talent for gender politics was in enough individual cases sufficiently clear. Their experience of the same offices and the same restaurants and the same Hamptons weekends was not the same experience that the men had, and the accounts they have given of it in the decades since are worth taking seriously as a corrective to the predominantly male mythology of the decade. The 1980s Wall Street story is not just a story about men. It is a story about a world in transition in which the institutions and cultures built by one set of people were being entered with great difficulty and with incomplete welcome by another set of people who had as much right to be there but were encountering a world that had not been built for them. Any account of what it was like to be on Wall Street in the 1980s that stops short of October 1987 is incomplete, because October 1987 was the moment when everything that had been building in the decade suddenly and violently reorganized itself, and the experience of that reorganization was one that shaped the people who went through it in ways that no period of ordinary market functioning could have. The background to the crash had been developing for months. The bull market of 1982 to 1987 had pushed stock valuations to levels that were, by most historical measures, elevated. The trade deficit had been widening, inflation had been ticking up, interest rates had been rising through the middle of 1987 as the Federal Reserve tried to preempt a return of the inflationary conditions of the 1970s. In September and early October, the market had already declined meaningfully from its August peak, but nothing in the weeks leading up to Monday, October 19th, 1987, fully prepared anyone for what was about to happen. On that Monday morning, traders arrived to find the futures markets in severe decline, the result of a weekend of bad news and cascading sell orders from portfolio insurance programs, computer-driven hedging strategies that automatically sold stock futures when prices fell, creating a mechanical feedback loop that, when the Friday selling had not yet fully hit the markets, was positioned to generate an enormous additional wave of selling at the Monday open. The details of what happened next were specific and technical, but the experience of it was simply this. The market fell and kept falling with a speed and a force that no one who was on the floor or at a trading desk that day has ever forgotten. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by 508 points on that single day, a decline of 22.6%, the largest single day percentage decline in the history of the index, larger than any single day of the 1929 crash. 508 points sounds modest by the standards of later decades, when the index would be measured in thousands and then tens of thousands, but as a percentage of the total value, it was catastrophic. The experience on the trading floor was one of controlled panic, or sometimes of panic that was not entirely controlled. The phones rang without stopping. Clients called to sell, to get out, to reduce exposure, but executing the sales was nearly impossible because the market was so overwhelmed with sell orders that there was effectively no market in many stocks for extended periods. The specialists on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, whose job it was to maintain orderly markets by being willing to buy when everyone else was selling, were overwhelmed and in some cases simply stopped trading entirely. Traders who had positions, who were long stocks or stock futures that were falling, watched their profit and loss statements deteriorate in real time, the numbers scrolling on the screens becoming more and more negative with each passing minute. The risk managers were on the phone to the trading desks. Senior management was on the phone to the risk managers. The Federal Reserve was on the phone to the heads of the major banks. The whole apparatus of the financial system was simultaneously in motion, and for those terrible hours, not quite in control of itself. The aftermath of the crash was, in several ways, less catastrophic than the day itself suggested it might be. The Federal Reserve intervened aggressively, providing liquidity and making clear that it would do whatever was necessary to prevent the financial system from seizing up entirely. The market recovered significantly in the days and weeks after the crash. The recession that many economists had predicted as the inevitable consequence of a 22% market decline did not materialize. The economy kept growing, tentatively at first, and then more robustly through 1988 and into 1989. By the summer of 1989, the Dow had recovered all of its crash losses and was making new highs. But the crash had changed something in the culture of the people who had been through it. The sense of invulnerability that had characterized the mid-decade peak, the feeling that the market only went up, that the good times were a new permanent condition rather than a cycle, that the people who were profiting from it were doing so because they were genuinely exceptional rather than because they happened to be positioned correctly at a specific and unusual moment in financial history. That sense did not fully recover. The people who had been young traders and bankers at the peak of the decade and who had gone through October 1987 carried a different understanding of how things worked, a chastened awareness that the system that had made them wealthy had also demonstrated in one terrible day that it could take everything back just as quickly. The other defining event of the late 1980s Wall Street story was the wave of insider trading investigations that began in 1986 and gathered force through the end of the decade, prosecuted primarily by Rudolph Giuliani as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and that brought down some of the most prominent names in the industry in ways that reverberated through the entire community. The inside trading scandal was not separate from the broader story of the decade's excesses. It was, in a sense, the logical consequence of them, the point at which the culture of aggressive deal making and information advantage, taken to its extreme, crossed into criminality in ways that the participants had not always clearly distinguished. The Boesky case was the pivot point. Ivan Boesky was an arbitrageur, someone who traded in the stocks of companies that were rumored or known to be acquisition targets, betting on the spread between the current price and the eventual acquisition price. It was legitimate business, and Boesky had been extraordinarily successful at it. Too successful, it turned out, by a degree that attracted the attention of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The investigation revealed that Boesky had been systematically purchasing information about upcoming deals from investment bankers who were involved in those deals, paying substantial amounts for advance notice of transactions that he could then position himself to profit from before the announcement became public. This was the definition of insider trading. In November 1986, Boesky agreed to pay a $100 million fine and cooperate with investigators. His cooperation opened a window into the broader network of information trading that had been operating throughout the decade, and the names that emerged from that investigation cascaded through the industry like a detonation through a structure that had been more fragile than it appeared. Michael Milken, the inventor of the junk bond market, and by 1986, probably the single most powerful individual on Wall Street, was among the eventual targets. The investigation of Milken and Drexel Burnham Lambert stretched from the initial Boesky cooperation through 1989 and resulted in Drexel's bankruptcy and Milken's guilty plea to securities violations and tax fraud, followed by a sentence of 10 years in prison, later reduced to 2 years. The collapse of Drexel was, on its own, a seismic event. This was not a marginal firm, but one of the most important financial institutions of the decade, and its disappearance removed from the market the primary creator and distributor of the junk bonds that had financed the decade's wave of leveraged buyouts. The effect of all of this on the culture of Wall Street was complex, and not entirely as the prosecutors might have hoped. The investigations and convictions demonstrated that the legal lines had been crossed at the highest levels of the industry, and they resulted in real consequences for real people. But they did not produce a wholesale reform of the culture, and they did not eliminate the practices that had enabled the specific abuses, the information advantages, the aggressive deal culture, the blurring of the line between competitive intelligence gathering and the improper use of material, non-public information. What they produced instead was a heightened awareness of where the legal lines were, a more careful attention to the specific behaviors that had attracted prosecution, and in some cases, a genuine moral reckoning among the people who had been adjacent to the abuses without being directly involved. The decade was ending. The specific conditions that had produced it were changing, and the industry was preparing, not entirely consciously, to become something somewhat different in the decade that followed. By 1989 and 1990, the specific world that had defined the decade's image was beginning to dissolve. The leveraged buyout boom, which had been one of the primary engines of fee generation for the major investment banks throughout the mid-decade, ran into the debt market's growing reluctance to fund deals at the valuations that the late stages of a prolonged boom had produced. The collapse of the RJR Nabisco deal, which had been the largest leveraged buyout in history when it closed in early 1989, and the subsequent difficulties of many other heavily leveraged companies signaled that the era of easy money for dealmakers was transitioning into something more complicated. Commercial real estate, which had been another beneficiary of the decade's credit expansion, began showing serious strains. The savings and loan crisis, the failure of hundreds of savings and loan institutions that had made bad bets with depositor money under the permissive regulatory environment of the early 1980s, was costing the federal government hundreds of billions of dollars in bailout costs and was reshaping the entire landscape of American banking. The young men and women who had arrived on Wall Street in the early and middle years of the decade were now at the decade's end in their early and mid 30s. They had made money. Some of them had made a great deal of money, had lived through a period of prosperity and excess that they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe to people who hadn't been there. They had also seen the limits of that world, the crash of 1987, the prosecutions, the collapse of firms they had worked for or been adjacent to, the specific kinds of personal cost that the intensity of the decade had extracted. Some of them had left the industry, burned out or prosecuted, or simply ready for something with different parameters. Many had stayed and were adapting to the changed conditions of the early 1990s, recalibrating expectations, adjusting strategies, learning the specific lessons of the decade's extremes. A few had become very wealthy in ways that gave them genuine financial independence, the ability to step off the treadmill permanently if they chose to. The culture they left behind them was not the same culture they had entered. Wall Street in 1991 was a different place from Wall Street in 1982, not in its fundamental dynamics, but in its specific social texture, its specific relationship to excess, its specific understanding of where the lines were. The double breasted suits were giving way to the more restrained tailoring of the early 1990s. The openly aggressive consumption had moderated somewhat, the social wisdom having absorbed the message that visible extravagance in a period of economic difficulty was not well received. The cocaine had retreated from its position of near casual social acceptance, partly in response to the legal consequences that had caught up with some users, and partly in response to the broader cultural shift away from the drug that happened across multiple industries simultaneously in the late decade. The era was over, and the era's specific artifacts, the big phones, the red suspenders, the specific restaurants, the specific clubs, the specific music, were beginning their transition from current reality to period detail. What endured was the fundamental structure, the compensation culture, the long hours, the performance obsession, the specific identities that the industry produced in the people who stayed in it long enough. These things did not change when the aesthetic of the decade changed. They persisted, and they persist today, because they are not accidents of fashion, but structural features of an industry built around the management of large sums of money in highly competitive conditions. The red suspenders are gone. The underlying dynamics are not. Looking back at the 1980s Wall Street world from any significant temporal distance, the question that comes up again and again is what it all meant. Not in a moralistic sense, not as an exercise in judgment, but as a genuine inquiry into what it was about the specific conditions of that moment that produced the specific behavior and the specific culture that it produced. This is a question that the people who lived through it have been asked and have asked themselves ever since. The most honest answers tend to be complicated. The people who were young Wall Street brokers in the 1980s were in most cases intelligent, hardworking, ambitious people who had been placed by the specific circumstances of their time in an environment that rewarded certain behaviors and punished others, and who adapted to that environment in the ways that intelligent people adapt to the environments they find themselves in. The extraordinary compensation was real. The market opportunities were real. The intellectual demands of the work, the genuine complexity of pricing derivatives, structuring leveraged buyouts, managing large portfolios across multiple asset classes were real. The camaraderie of the trading floor, the specific satisfaction of executing a difficult trade well, the pleasure of a long term client relationship built on trust and mutual benefit. These things were real too. What was also real was the damage, the personal damage, the marriages that didn't survive the hours, the children who grew up largely without their fathers present, the friendships outside the industry that withered from neglect. The social damage, the specific way in which a culture that glorified greed as a virtue contributed to a broader social shift in how Americans thought about the relationship between individual wealth and the common good. The regulatory damage, the decades of institutional capture of the revolving door between regulators and the regulated, of the systematic erosion of the safeguards that had been built after the last time the financial system had been allowed to run without adequate oversight, damage that would not fully manifest in its consequences until the financial crisis of 2008. These were not small things. They were not erased by the genuine economic benefits that the decade's financial innovation also produced. The 1980s Wall Street broker, in the end, was a product of a very specific set of circumstances that are now fully historical, circumstances that have not exactly recurred, even as the industry has continued to grow and evolve and produce new generations of its own particular kind of person. The red suspenders are a period detail. The specific films and restaurants and clubs are period details. The crack and fizz of the particular bull market that made everything possible is a period detail. What remains are the questions the era posed about what work is for, about what money is for, about the relationship between professional identity and personal life, about what an economy that distributes its gains this unevenly does to the people at the high end of that distribution as well as to those at the low end. These are not period questions. They are still live, still in motion, still without fully satisfying answers. There is a version of the 1980s Wall Street story that is all daytime, the trading floor at 9:30, the power lunch, the bonus announcement, the crash. But the nights deserve their own section because the nights were where the life became most itself, stripped of the professional performance, closer to what was actually there underneath all the armor. On the nights when the day had gone well, when a big trade had been executed cleanly, when a deal had closed, when the bonus conversation had gone better than expected, There was a specific quality to the celebration that followed. It was not restrained. It was not the celebration of people who had decided in advance to celebrate moderately. It was the release of pressure that had been building for weeks or months, the letting go of something that had required enormous sustained effort, and it expressed itself in the ways that this particular culture expressed release. The expensive dinner, the multiple bottles of wine, the move afterward to a bar or a club, the late night conversations that became gradually less coherent and more honest as the evening lengthened, the cab home at 2 in the morning through streets that were still busy with other people, also at the tail end of their own nights. The alarm would go off in 4 hours. That was a tomorrow problem. On the nights when the day had gone badly, when a significant trade had lost money, when a client had pulled a mandate, when the news had gone against the positions you were holding, the evening was different in character. Some people went home and drank alone, which was its own kind of ritual, the specific privacy of absorbing a loss in the solitude of a small apartment with a glass of scotch and the television on and the phone turned off. Some people stayed at the desk late, reviewing what had happened and trying to understand it. The analytical mode, a more comfortable posture than the emotional one. Some people went out anyway, because being alone with the loss was worse than being surrounded by other people, even if those other people had no idea what you were carrying. The close friendships that formed in this world were forged in the specific alchemy of shared extremity. The person who had been next to you at the desk on October 19th, 1987, when the market fell apart and you were both trying to manage positions that were deteriorating in real time. That person understood something about you and about the experience that no one who had been there could. The analyst who had spent 3 consecutive nights with you working on a pitch book, surviving on coffee and the specific gallows humor that extreme fatigue produces, that person was your person in a way that had nothing to do with whether you had anything else in common. The friendships were often instrumental in origin, born out of proximity and shared circumstance rather than elected affinity, and they were sometimes, after the circumstances changed and the proximity ended, difficult to sustain. But while they lasted, they had an intensity that came directly from the intensity of the situation that had produced them. The late night conversations that happened on the trading floor when the markets had closed and most of the staff had gone home were their own institution. The floor after hours had a completely different quality from the floor during the day, quieter, darker in the corners where the overhead lights had been dimmed, the screens still glowing but no longer urgent, the phones quiet. The senior traders who stayed late, either out of genuine work necessity or out of the habit of not quite knowing how to be anywhere else, would sometimes have conversations in this setting that were more honest and more personal than anything that happened during the day, because the audience was gone and the performance could be suspended. These were the conversations about what was actually happening, not the official narrative of confidence and competence, but the real assessment, the private doubts, the questions about whether the particular strategy that had been working was going to keep working, the acknowledgement that nobody actually knew what the market was going to do tomorrow, and that all the analysis and all the conviction was at some level still just a well reasoned bet. The phones at home after 10 p.m. still rang. Not often, but enough that the work had followed you into whatever was left of the evening. A client in a different time zone with a question, a deal that had developed a problem, a counterpart calling from a market that was already open somewhere in Asia. The phone was picked up because not picking it up was not really an option, not if you were the kind of person who intended to remain in the industry at the level you were operating at. The work did not observe the boundary of the apartment door. It was the first thing in the morning and the last thing at night, and the thing that woke you at 3 a.m. when you couldn't sleep, lying in the dark and running through the numbers of a position that was bothering you, unable to turn the analytical mind off because it had been trained too thoroughly and for too long to operate in any other mode. This was the texture of the nights, and it was the texture of the years, and it was the texture of the specific kind of life that the 1980s Wall Street culture produced in the people who fully inhabited it. Not just the Rolex and the Hamptons house and the power lunch and the big bonus. Those things were real, but they were the public face of something more complicated underneath. Something that had a high cost as well as a high reward, that asked for everything and occasionally gave back a great deal and occasionally gave back almost nothing, that marked the people who went through it in ways that took years to fully understand, and that some of them are still in the process of understanding now. The nights eventually ended, as nights do. The alarm came in the dark, and the body, whatever condition it was in, got up and began again. That was the life. That was for better and worse, and everything in between. Exactly what it was. The decade produced its particular kind of person with a thoroughness that is still visible in the culture it left behind. The language it generated, junk bonds, leveraged buyout, hostile takeover, inside information, too big to fail, entered the general vocabulary and stayed there. The archetypes it created, the aggressive trader, the deal-hungry banker, the young man in the expensive suit with the enormous appetite for risk and reward, became cultural touchstones that writers and filmmakers and journalists and regulators have been returning to ever since, because the archetype captured something true about a particular set of human desires and a particular set of social conditions that do not go away just because the specific decade in which they were most visible has passed. The 1980s Wall Street broker is, in this sense, a figure for something more general than his specific time and place, a figure for the specific human configuration that emerges when ambition and money and competitive pressure are combined in an environment with very high stakes and relatively limited constraint. He appeared in the 1980s in a particular form. He has appeared in other forms, before and since. He will appear again in whatever form the next particular set of conditions produces. The specific suspenders change. The underlying person persists. What it was actually like to be him on any given ordinary day, the alarm at 5:30, the cab through the early morning streets, the noise of the trading floor, the lunch at the good table, the phone that rang at 11 at night. That is what we've tried to sit with tonight. Not the mythology. The reality, or as close to it as a quiet evening's worth of slow attention can bring us. The city that held all of this together, the specific New York of the 1980s, the city before the cleanup and the gentrification and the economic reshaping that would follow in the 1990s was itself a character in the story. The grittier New York of that era, the city where Times Square still had its seedy energy, where certain neighborhoods below 14th Street were still genuinely rough, where the contrast between the towers of Midtown and the deteriorating neighborhoods of the South Bronx was stark enough to feel like a moral statement. That city provided a specific backdrop against which the finance world's wealth and ambition were illuminated in a particularly sharp light. The Wall Street broker in his Lincoln Town car passing through neighborhoods that the boom had not reached was not an abstraction. He was a real person in a real car, in a real city, embedded in a specific set of social and economic arrangements that extended far beyond the trading floor and the client dinner. What he made of that, what any of them made of it, varied enormously from person to person, but the context was always there, insisting on being noticed, whether it was noticed or not. And now it is late, and you have traveled a long way through a world that is close enough to be familiar and far enough away to feel like somewhere else. Let it recede now, gently. Let the trading floor empty out and go quiet. Let the phones go still. Let the suits hang in the closet, and the Rolexes sit on the nightstand, and the bonus checks sit in the accounts, and all the noise and energy and ambition of that particular world settle into the comfortable distance of history, into the soft pastness of everything that has already happened and can now be observed without urgency, without stakes, without the need to do anything at all except notice that it was real, and that the people in it were real, and that it has passed, and that you are here, and still, and safe, and the night is quiet around you, and sleep is very close now. There are people who are still alive, who lived through all of it, who arrived on the trading floor in 1982 or 1983 as 22-year-olds with their freshly printed diplomas and their new suits, who rode the bull market to its peak, who survived the crash, who watched the decade end and the next one begin, and the world they had known transform itself into something adjacent but different. Some of them are in their 60s now, retired or semi-retired, looking back at a decade that feels, from this distance, almost impossibly vivid, too loud, too bright, too full of specific details that the memory insists on holding on to. The smell of the trading floor, the specific sound of the turret phone, the particular weight of a bonus check in your hand, the moment before you opened the envelope, the silence of the Hamptons in September after the summer had ended and the houses had closed up and the beach was empty again. These are the things they remember, and somewhere in those memories, underneath the mythology and the decades of retrospective interpretation, is the simple fact of having been young and ambitious in a very particular time and place, and of having been shaped by it in ways that turned out to be permanent. That is the story. That, with all its noise and all its quiet, is what it was really like. And so we've come to the end of another long, quiet evening. We started in the early morning darkness of a Manhattan apartment in 1982, and we've moved slowly through a world that is close enough to be recognizable and far enough away to feel genuinely like another time, another set of assumptions, another set of values, another texture of daily life, arranged around a very specific relationship to money and to the idea of what a life well lived was supposed to look like. the double-breasted suit, the turret phone, the trading floor at 9:30 in the morning, the bonus check in December, the Rolex, the Hamptons house, the dinner at the Four Seasons. October 19th, 1987. The silence after the close. It was a world built at high speed and at high volume, and it has left marks on the world that followed it that we are still in the process of fully understanding. As you lie here now, in whatever room and whatever time zone you're in, perhaps already somewhere between this voice and the edge of sleep, you might let those images soften and recede, the noise of the trading floor going quiet, the phones going still, the street outside the office growing dark, the long day over, the body finally giving in to the weariness that has been building since before the sun came up. The particular relief of that, of a day that demanded everything finally being done, finally releasing its hold. There is something almost peaceful about that image, even in a world as relentless as that one was. The end of the day came eventually. It always came. The body required rest, regardless of what the market had done or what the bonus was going to be, regardless of the deal that still needed to close or the client who still needed calling. Sleep came for everyone, even there. There's no quiz. There are no details you need to remember. There is only the slow, quiet permission to let this all go and rest. Let the trading floor empty out. Let the screens go dark. Let the phones go quiet. Let your own day, whatever it held, settle into the distance behind you. You are here, and the day is done, and nothing requires your attention right now. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift loose. Let the voice carry you a little further from wakefulness and a little closer to wherever sleep is waiting. Thank you for spending this quiet time with Drowsy History. Wherever you are tonight, whatever time it is there, I hope this helped. Leave a comment when you wake up. Tell me where you were and what time it was, and whether you made it through to the end or drifted off somewhere in the middle of the trading floor. It always means a great deal to hear from you. Rest well. Good night.